Hey guys, welcome to part 2 of this tutorial series. I'm Shayan and I'll be your host for today. Today we'll be looking at the shaders for the sneaker. And before we start, as usual, let us take a look at the outline of this video. This is where we left off in part 1. First, we will delete the other shoe. Click and drag. Selects all the objects, press X, delete. We will work on this shoe, and once we are done with all the shading, then we can quickly generate the mirror image once again. First, we need to check whether this shoe has the correct physical measurements or not. The scale of the object affects the camera-object relationship and thus the final result. So, to do that, click on Scene Properties. Under the Units tab, you have the unit system, set this to metric and the length to centimeters. You can use your own preferred unit system. Click and drag to select all the objects. Press N on the keyboard. Under the item tab, you have dimensions here. The dimensions displayed here are of the active object. If you press Shift and click on a new object, you see that it becomes the active object. It is indicated by the yellow color outline. So we want to select the sole of the shoe. We want this to be the active object because this is the longest part of the shoe. Along the y-axis is the length of the sole. It is 25 centimeters and I think it is alright for our scene. Maybe decrease a little bit more, 22. If you have incorrect scale in your scene, make sure you deal with that first before getting into the other things. So let us start renaming all the objects in our scene. Since we'll be using the outliner a lot, I would like to have more real estate on the screen for the outliner. Click on these borders and drag them so that we can see the object tree much more clearly. Select the first object in the outliner, double click to rename. This is called the welt. We will call it welt 1 because we have another one here. This should be welt 2. The toe cap, the quarter, tongue, laces, the sole of the shoe. This should be the eyelet rings. You can see we have the reference images here as empties. So select them and then right click to delete. Now we will select all the objects and press M on the keyboard. Select new collection. Give it a name like sneaker maybe. You have a new collection called sneaker. We are done with organizing the scene. Now let's get into the shaders. Let me pull this up real quick. We'll be starting with the sole of the shoe. Select, go to material properties, click on new. It adds in a new material. Let us call it rubber. We will be having 3 different materials on this object. You can add a new material by clicking on this add material slot. Press it twice because we'll be having 3 materials. This is going to be assigned to the same object but at different sections of the object. So click on the second slot, click new, name it something like rubber 2, rubber 3. Let's start color coding the object. We will use the viewport display tab. Click on color, change the color. You can see we have the matte cap on, so it's not showing up properly. So go on top here, drag with the middle click. Click on this drop down, switch to studio. Now we can see the colors more clearly. Let's select the second one. Do the same with rubber 3. We skipped over the sole of the shoe, so let us quickly add a new material slot. Click on new, let's call it sole. Give it a different color. Now it's time to assign the materials to the correct part of the mesh. Tab into edit mode, click on the modifier properties and make sure you have this on cage button enabled. Press 3 on the keyboard to switch to face select mode. Now we will zoom in and select those faces which are relevant to the sole of the shoe. Click on the material properties, sole, click assign. You can see that the material has been assigned. Similarly for the other parts, double click on an edge to select the faces along this loop. Using C middle click, deselect the unnecessary faces. We have a clipping problem here. We can fix that by pressing N on the keyboard. Under the View tab, change the clip start to the lowest possible value. Under Material Properties, select Rubber 3 and click Assign. Now for Rubber 2, we want the material to be assigned to the reliefs on the sole of the shoe, in the front and the back. Now we also want to select the edge loop right next to the faces. We can do that by pressing Ctrl+. You can also do that by clicking on Select, select More. Now click on Rubber 2 and hit Assign. Select the quarter, New. We will have two materials here, fabric black and fabric yellow. Let's assign a color to fabric black and fabric yellow. Select the quarter, press Ctrl I on the keyboard to invert the selection. Press H to hide all the other objects. Go into the modifier stack, apply the solidify modifier. Hit Tab to go into the edit mode. Enable on cage. Now we can select and then assign the materials. Go into the Material Properties, select Fabric Yellow and then Assign. We will make a few adjustments here. Unhide all the other objects. The tongue of the shoe has the same materials, so we'll do the same with the tongue. Select the toe cap, assign rubber, select the laces, click New. We will call it Fabric Laces. Select the welt, click New. We will call this material Rubber Black. Same for the other welt. Click on the eyelet rings, new material called Metal. You can make it look more metallic in the viewport using this value. You can see we have a problem here. The sole is visible from the outside, but we want in fact this fabric yellow material to be here. So we just need to assign it to the sole itself. Select the sole of the shoe, Ctrl I to invert the selection, press H to hide it. Go to the top view, tab into edit mode. Add a new material slot. From this drop down, select Fabric Yellow. Unhide with Alt H. So the primary fabric texture that we'll be using, it is seamless. It's available at textures.com. The file for this tutorial has all the textures packed in the blend file. So you can download the blend file and have access to all the textures. We will start with the fabric black material. Select the quarter, select fabric black, then switch to the shading workspace. Currently, we're in the viewport shading mode. So first, I will hide the unnecessary settings. Shift A, and you can add any kind of input node here. So let's just use value and then connect it to the relevant inputs. We'll be using base color, specular, roughness, and normal. Select the principled BSDF. Press Ctrl H on the keyboard. Then delete the value node. Now the node editor looks much cleaner. Before proceeding with the tutorial, make sure you have the Node Wrangler add-on installed. Shift A, texture, image texture. We will have 3 copies of this. I'm duplicating with Shift T. We'll have the diffuse map, specular map, and the normal map. Select the first image texture node and press Ctrl T on the keyboard. Now we have a mapping node and a texture coordinate node set up. Connect the color output to the base color. Click Open Image. I have the textures here. I will select the diffuse map. In this tutorial, we are going to use the generated texture coordinate. You can see that the texture is wonky at places. That's because flat projection method does not work well with the generated texture coordinate. So change that to box. Head on over to the mapping node and under the scale, play with these values until you get a desirable result. I found out that these values work perfectly well with this scene. Shift A, color, RGB curves. Now we will increase the contrast. We don't want to overdo it, just a little bit. Shift A, converter, color ramp. Adjust the left handle until we get a desirable look. Now let's move on to the specular map. Connect the vector output. Open, select the specular map. Change this to box and change the color space to non-color because specular and normal maps use non-color data. Shift A, converter, color ramp. Now press Ctrl Shift and then click on the color ramp node, and this will generate an emission viewer node. So adjust the contrast of the specular map. Once you're happy with this, plug it into the specular input. We will change the roughness to something like 0.8. Now as you can see, we have lost any control over the specular value. To control it, we will use a math node. Shift A, converter, math. Change this to multiply. Use this value to control the overall specularity. 0.4 does the job in my opinion. Now for the normal map. Shift A, vector, normal map. Connect it to the normal input. Object space and strength to something like 0.95. So we can call the fabric black material finished. Under render properties, check ambient occlusion and bloom. Under shadows, enable soft shadows and high bit depth. For the fabric yellow material, we'll be using the same exact node setup except the color ramp node. Select all the nodes, press Ctrl G on the keyboard. It forms a new group. Press Tab to go out of it. Now give it a name like copy. It's registered in the memory, so you do not need to keep it here. Just press Ctrl Alt G to ungroup it once again. Click on the material properties, select fabric yellow, press A to select all the nodes, press X and delete them. Shift A, group, copy. Now you can ungroup them using Ctrl Alt G. What we did here is essentially copied all the nodes from fabric black to fabric yellow. So what we will do is we will delete the RGB curves node and the color ramp node using X on the keyboard. Let me connect this first. Now we'll be using a hue saturation value node. It's under color. Set the hue to 0.8. I like a little bit of more saturation. We can add a little bit of contrast here. Press Ctrl A, color, RGB curves, drop it in there. This looks fine. Let us decrease the normal strength of the yellow fabric to make it look a little bit different from the black one. And let us make some final changes to the EEVEE render settings. Click on render properties. Set trace precision to 1. Check bent normals. Screen space reflections. I do not like the HDRI in the viewport currently, so click on this drop down. Select some other HDRI, like maybe this one. Let us rotate it. This looks much better. Select the laces. Let's start working on the fabric laces material. We will repeat the same thing here. We will exclude all the unnecessary settings. Set the base color to almost black. I would add a slight tint of green to make things look a little bit interesting. Decrease the specular because it's going to be a fabric material after all. Increase the roughness. We are going for a synthetic fabric kind of look. We will add some transmission, a slight hint of translucency. Right now the laces look very flat and clean. Let's add in a noise texture. Shift A, texture, noise texture. Select it, Ctrl T, Shift A, vector, bump. Feed in the factor into the height, normal. Increase the scale to something like 20. Add a very slight bit of distortion. Decrease the detail. Set the distance to something very low. And adjust the strength so that it's hardly visible. This looks good enough to me. Click on the toe cap. We will now work on the rubber shader. get rid of the unnecessary settings. We will add a very slight amount of subsurface scattering. Click on subsurface radius, select all three. 0.2 works well. Having the same value for all the three channels, make sure that the subsurface scattering color is white. Set the specular to 0.3 and the roughness to 0.6. Let's go back to previous. This does not make much of a difference right now, but these small things add up. Under the render properties, you have subsurface scattering. And by the way, we will be using Christensen-Burle instead of random walk. Random walk does all the physically correct calculations. We do not need such level of accuracy because we have a very small amount of subsurface here. Let us now make the rubber 2 material. Let us copy the node groups here like we did for the fabric material. Ctrl G, tab, name it. Ctrl Alt G. Now the rubber 2 material is for the front and the back reliefs. Click on material properties, select rubber 2. Select them with A and then press X to delete them. Shift A, group, copy rubber, Ctrl Alt G. For this one, we will like to tweak the specular a little bit and the roughness will be a little bit less. Other than that, let's keep everything else the same. Shift A, vector, bump. Now you will notice that we do not have the normal input, so we have to expand this with Ctrl H. Here we have the normal, so let's plug normal into this socket. Decrease the distance to something like 0.01. Shift A, texture, wave texture. Plug in the factor into the height. Press Ctrl T. We will be using the object coordinate. So play with the rotation values and try to align this texture with the z-axis. This looks good enough to me. Let us decrease the strength just a little bit. We can play with the scale value as well. Check the texture on the back. We will go with this. The rubber 3 material is an extension of the rubber 2 material, so we'll be copying all the nodes. We'll be using the generated texture coordinate. Then we will duplicate this wave texture. Press Shift D. Duplicate this mapping node. Place it here. Reset the rotation. Reset the rotation here. Press Ctrl Shift right click to mix. Set this to multiply. Set the factor to 1. And now plug this into the height. Let's go back. Right now we have not set up the mapping properly. What we are trying to do here is we are trying to create a grid using two sets of intersecting parallel lines in the form of the wave texture. Press Ctrl Shift click on the first wave texture. Set the correct angle. By looking at the preview, change the scale. It's going to be a lot denser. In fact, we'll be using the same scale for both the wave texture. Rather than setting it twice, let us use a value node. Shift A, input, value. Plug this into the scale. Rotate till we get rid of these seams. Now it is very consistent and uniform. Now Ctrl Shift click on the second wave texture. So like I said, we need two sets of parallel lines which intersect each other and they are at right angles to each other. So that's very important here. That's why I added this mapping node here. So just set the Y and Z to be 90 degrees. Now if you compare, they are both perpendicular to each other. So when we feed both of them into the multiply node, we get the grid that we wanted. If you take a closer look at this, the boxes that are formed due to the grid, they hold the white values and the lines themselves are black. So when we feed this texture into the bump node, it elevates only the white parts. So we get a certain effect. But what we want is we need elevation along the lines to create a crisscross pattern. So you will notice that it's very easy to do that. If you just use invert, then it reverses the direction. Now you can observe the effect properly. rubber black for the welts. And I promise this is going to be the last rubber material we are going through in this tutorial. So nothing fancier. Delete these nodes. Press Shift A, group, copy rubber, because this is rubber after all. We'll just change the color to black. Add a tint of blue maybe. Push the specular a little bit. Okay. These eyelet rings here, they need just a very simple metal shader. For this, just set the metallic to 1. Make sure that the roughness doesn't get very low. 0.3 will be a good choice. That's because if you take a look at the reference, you will see that the reflections are not super glossy. There's a slight hint of roughness to it. Now finally we are going to work on the sole of the shoe. For this material we'll be using an image texture. We need UV editing for that. Click on UV editing. My model is already UV unwrapped from the time lapse, so I will demonstrate how to do it once again. Go to the bottom view, select the sole, tab into edit mode, select the faces, press U on the keyboard, project from view, and then scale it up. After that, click on UV, export UV layout to a PNG file like I did for this one. I will not do that again. So get done with the UV unwrapping and then you can follow along. Click on sole in the material properties. First things first, we will change the base color to dark brown. Fine. Now let's add the image texture. Now you can UV unwrap, export the layout and then create your own image. Download something, or you can use the one which I have made. So you can download it from the YouTube description. Press Shift A, texture, image texture, press Ctrl T. Note the texture coordinate is UV. Open, navigate, select the black and white image. I have created a normal map, but it did not work that well, most probably because it has very sharp gradient between the white and the blacks. Set the color space to non-color, press Shift A, vector, bump. Set the distance to 0.01 and decrease the strength. Turns out while demonstrating the UV unwrapping, I messed up the UV layout. So let's go back to UV editing. Turn on material preview here. And that's all right. Now you can see that the other parts of the shoe are pretty plain. So let us mix it up a little bit and multiply a noise texture with it. Press Shift A, texture, noise texture, Ctrl T, and we'll use the generated texture coordinate. Now press Ctrl Shift right click and click and drag to mix them both. Plug it into the height. Add. Enable clamp that keeps the value between 0 and 1. Now play around with the scale and the detail. Now the strength for the noise texture seems way over the top. Let us decrease the factor. We will duplicate this. Ctrl Shift right click, drag to mix this new noise texture with the image texture. And that in turn feeds into the previous add node. We want this to be multiply and the scale to be much less. The factor only applies to the second input. So even if you have 0 here, you still have the first color input intact. We want the reverse effect. We want the text to be there all the time and we should be able to control the factor of the new noise texture. So flip this connection. And if you adjust the factor now, you get some nice looking wear and tear effect. Right now, if you switch to the cycles render engine, switch to the rendered mode. Currently, we do not have any lighting setup for our cycles scene. So click on the world properties. We will use an environment texture. So it is very clear that the shaders work in both the render engines. Now we can call the tutorial finished. We are done with all the materials, but you might be wondering where are the stitches? I will not include it in this video. That is because the stitching seems to be a topic of its own, and I think I have a couple of different ways of doing that. So we will look at it in the part 3 of this tutorial, or I will upload a bonus for this part. And just like the previous video, you can download this file. The link is provided in the YouTube description.